When we hear the word knight, our minds immediately conjure images of shining armour, noble deeds and gallant heroes riding across lush European landscapes. Stories of Arthur's Round Table, Roland's courage and knights defending their ladies from dragons and dark forces fill our imagination. But behind this glittering veneer lies a far darker, grimmer reality. Medieval knights were not always paragons of virtue. Many were professional killers, mercenaries and bandits who thrived on fear, violence and greed. For the ordinary people of the Middle Ages, the arrival of a knight on horseback could signal terror rather than salvation. The ideal of chivalry codified in poetry and song was often nothing more than a mask, a literary invention to sanitize the brutality of feudal society. Chronicles from France, England and the Holy Roman Empire describe knights who burned villages, extorted peasants, betrayed their lords, and committed atrocities under the guise of loyalty or religious duty. Yet even as history reveals their brutality, the image of the knight as hero persists. It is a paradox. The same figure who could be a monster to peasants became immortalized as the epitome of courage and honor in literature. Tonight we will peel away the shining armor and explore the hidden truth. We will examine how knights became both feared and admired, celebrated in stories, but remembered in history for terror, bloodshed, and ultimately their decline. We will journey through wars, massacres, betrayals, and the slow fading of their influence as new weapons and social structures reshaped Europe. From the pillaging routiers of France to the bloody crusades in Jerusalem and Constantinople, from infamous individual knights to the collapse of their dominance on the battlefield, the story of medieval knights is as thrilling as it is horrifying. Prepare to step back in time beyond the legends to witness knights as they truly were. Monsters in steel and leather shadows of glory, living and dying in a world shaped by violence and ambition. Their legacy is a mirror of the Middle Ages itself, both dark and mesmerizing, brutal and awe-inspiring. Warriors without a war. When knights were not on the battlefield, many found themselves facing an unexpected enemy boredom. For professional warriors trained to kill a life without war was a dangerous void. With no battles to fight, their skills, honed through years of practice, became a tool for profit, or terror. In 12th and 13th century France, England and parts of Germany, bands of idle knights, known as routiers, roamed the countryside. These were men who had been trained from youth in swordplay, horsemanship, and the brutal art of combat. Deprived of war, they turned their expertise inward, preying on the very communities they were supposed to protect. Imagine a quiet village at dusk. Smoke curls from the chimneys, livestock grazes peacefully, and children play in the fields. Then in the distance the thunder of hooves grows louder. The villagers know what it means. Knights are coming. Armour clinks, swords gleam, and the banners of mercenary companies ripple in the wind. Within hours, homes are pillaged, barns set ablaze, and terrified families flee into the surrounding woods. Anyone who resists is cut down without mercy. Some knights went further, taking priest merchants or wealthy townspeople as hostages to ransom them back for coin. Chronicles tell of entire hamlets wiped out overnight, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. One peasant from Gascony wrote, "They came at dusk with torches. By dawn nothing remained but ash and corpses." Routiers were not isolated phenomena. In Germany and the Baltic region, knights also terrorized towns and villages under the guise of crusades or religious duty. They claimed land, demanded tribute, and extorted locals, effectively ruling through fear. Their names often appear in legal records not for acts of heroism, but for theft, murder, and intimidation. Yet even in these dark deeds, the knights maintained an image of honour among their peers. Within their circles, cunning ruthlessness and the ability to command men were admired traits. Outside of it, however, the same men were feared and reviled. Peasants coined bitter sayings such as "better the devil than the knight at your door." The paradox of the idle knight reveals the dark heart of feudal society. These were men whose lives were defined by combat, and without it their morality, if they ever had one, was twisted by opportunity and greed. They were both elite warriors and predators, men of skill and violence, whose actions blurred the line between warfare and criminality. This reality stands in stark contrast to the romanticized images of knights rescuing damsels or defending the weak. The truth is harsher. When knights were unemployed, they became instruments of terror, shaping the Middle Ages not only through battles, but through fear, oppression, and unbridled violence. And so even before the famous crusades or epic sieges, the shadow of the knight loomed over Europe, a shadow of power and menace that haunted villages, marketplaces, and the countryside. The knights' reputation for heroism coexisted uneasily, with their role as mercenary oppressors hinting at the complexity and the cruelty that defined the age of armoured men, crusades and atrocities. The First Crusade began in 1096, called by Pope Urban II with promises of salvation and glory. Thousands of knights rode across Europe, banners held high hearts filled with religious zeal, and yet the reality that awaited in the Holy Land was far from holy. When the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in 1099, they found a city rich, populous, and unprepared for the violence that would follow. Contemporary accounts describe streets clogged with corpses, blood flowing through alleys, and cries of terror filling the air. Muslim, Jewish, and even Christian inhabitants fell indiscriminately to the swords of knights who saw themselves as executing divine will. One chronicler wrote, "The city was filled with slaughter. Blood ran ankle deep, and the cries of women and children were unbearable." The Crusades were not only battles against foreign powers, they were campaigns of looting plunder and personal gain. Knights claimed wealth, silks, jewels, and religious relics often for themselves rather than for the church. In the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the knights never even reached the Holy Land. Instead, they turned on Constantinople, a Christian city, looting churches, breaking into monasteries and slaughtering residents. Witnesses described men tearing open sacred tombs and dragging clergy from altars, all under the banners of knights supposedly fighting for Christ. The brutality was systematic. Knights would encircle cities, starve inhabitants into submission, and then slaughter those who resisted. Women were not spared. Chronicles mention rape, abduction, and forced marriages as weapons to terrorize populations into obedience. It was a violence that was both strategic and personal, demonstrating that the sword of the knight served not only faith but fear. Even when some knights acted with restraint or honor, they were exceptions rather than the rule. Many sought to maximize wealth and personal glory, interpreting divine will as a justification for greed and cruelty. The romantic ideal of the crusader as a hero, defending the helpless, rarely matched the reality on the ground, and yet these campaigns left a legacy, one of fear, destruction, and historical notoriety. Villages and towns that survived often bore scars for decades, entire regions depopulated with fields untilled and fortresses abandoned. The Crusades cemented the knight's dual reputation, outwardly noble, inwardly ruthless. It was a time when piety and plunder were inseparable, when the knight's sword was a symbol of both divine mission and human cruelty. The shadow of this era still echoes through history, challenging the stories we tell about heroes, religion, and war. By understanding the Crusades not as epic tales of heroism, but as campaigns of strategy, greed, and violence, we glimpse the harsh reality of medieval knighthood. The knights who later became icons of honour in poems and ballads were in fact instruments of terror and ambition, wielding their swords for power as much as for faith. Their legends would later obscure the horrors they inflicted, transforming predators into heroes in the eyes of generations yet to come, infamous knights. While some knights became immortalized as paragons of chivalry, history remembers many others for far darker deeds. These were men whose names struck fear into peasants and nobles alike, whose armour concealed not honour but cruelty. Consider Robert Guiscard, a Norman adventurer of the 11th century. He carved out a powerful domain in southern Italy, celebrated by some as a brilliant strategist. Yet chroniclers also called him the Fox, a man whose cunning was matched only by his ruthlessness. He betrayed allies, slaughtered enemies, and showed no mercy to cities that resisted his conquest. Villages were burned, treasures seized, and inhabitants either enslaved or killed. His legend as a military genius is inseparable from his reputation as a predator in human form. In France, the routier continued to terrorize the countryside for decades. Knights who had been trained to serve their lords became mercenaries, extorting peasants for food money or favors. Small towns were forced to pay tribute under threat of fire and death, and those who resisted were slaughtered. Chroniclers recorded the anguish of communities wiped out in a single night. One villager's diary, preserved in fragments, recounts, "They came with fire and steel. Our homes, our livestock, even our priest were taken. We hid in the woods, praying they would pass us by, but many did not survive." William Marshall, often celebrated in later literature as the epitome of knightly virtue, also began his career in less honourable ways. Early on, he participated in raids and sieges motivated more by wealth and advancement than chivalry. Even knights who sought to build reputations for honour had to navigate a world in which betrayal and opportunism were often necessary for survival. The pattern was clear across Europe. Knights wielded immense power over the powerless. Peasants, merchants, and minor lords lived under a constant threat of violence. The knight's sword was not always a tool of justice, it was a weapon of coercion. Even within courts and castles, loyalty was fragile. Alliances shifted with convenience, and oaths were often broken when expedient. And yet, despite their brutality, these knights were often admired or feared by those of equal rank. Skill in battle, courage, and cunning were celebrated virtues among their peers. Outside of the noble circles, however, the same men were regarded as tyrants, gang leaders in steel and mail-shaping regions through fear and intimidation. These infamous knights exemplify the paradox of medieval chivalry, outward symbols of nobility and honour, yet in practice men capable of unimaginable cruelty. Their actions remind us that the legends we tell about knighthood, songs of valour, tales of loyalty and romanticised heroism, often obscured the grim reality. Knights were warriors, yes, but they were also predators in a society structured by violence and inequality. The stories of these men, their betrayals and their terror, linger in the chronicles of history, forming a shadowed counterpoint to the shining image of the heroic knight. They warn us that power without accountability, skill without restraint and armour without conscience can transform the supposed protectors of society into its greatest threat. Violence against the innocent. For all the glory and pageantry of knighthood, the harshest truth of medieval life was that ordinary people lived in fear of the very men who were supposed to be their protectors. Knights, especially those idle between wars or acting as mercenaries, wielded immense power over peasants, townsfolk, and even clergy, and often they used it without mercy. Across France, England and Germany chronicles detail raids on villages that were meant to punish or extract tribute, but frequently descended into indiscriminate slaughter. Houses were burned to the ground, livestock stolen or slaughtered, and fields destroyed, leaving families starving. The most vulnerable, women and children, often suffered the most. There are accounts of women being dragged from their homes, subjected to sexual violence, and forced into submission to demonstrate the knight's dominance. One chronicler from 12th century France wrote, "They came with fire and sword. Men were slain, homes burned, and the women taken. The land wept in silence." The terror inflicted by knights was both psychological and physical. Fleeing villagers described the sound of hooves thundering across the fields, swords clanging against shields, and the cries of the innocent echoing in the night. Peasants' diaries, often fragmentary, speak of hiding in woods or cellars for days praying that the marauders would move on. Resistance was usually met with death, and entire communities could be wiped out if they refused to pay tribute or bow to a knight's demands. Even the church, which preached morality and attempted to regulate knightly behaviour through the peace of God and truce of God decrees, struggled to curb the violence. Knights ignored edicts when convenient. They looted churches, harassed clergy, and showed no restraint toward non-combatants. For many peasants, there was no distinction between lawful military action and criminal raid. All knights, whether loyal to their lords or acting independently, were equally dangerous. The violence extended beyond simple robbery or intimidation. Chroniclers and historians recount episodes of gruesome executions, torture, and public displays of power meant to instill fear. A knight's reputation often relied on his ability to terrorize as much as to fight. In a culture where might often equaled right, brutality was a tool of governance and control. Yet for all their cruelty, knights were still celebrated in literature and myth as paragons of courage and virtue. This stark contrast between image and reality is one of the enduring paradoxes of medieval history. The same swords that were sung about in ballads were also used to strike down the defenceless, and the armour that gleamed in poems concealed men capable of monstrous acts. Violence against the innocent was not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of knightly life. It shaped communities, instilled deep fear, and left scars, physical, emotional, and societal, that lasted generations. For historians and storytellers alike, these grim truths force a reconsideration of what it truly meant to be a knight in the Middle Ages. Beyond the chivalric codes and romanticised tales, the knight was often a predator, and the innocent bore the weight of their power. The Church tries to control. Amidst the chaos wrought by knights across medieval Europe, the Church attempted to assert some semblance of order. With violence so rampant that it threatened not just peasants, but the stability of entire regions, ecclesiastical authorities introduced measures aimed at restraining the armoured warriors. One of the earliest efforts was the Peace of God movement initiated in the late 10th century. It sought to protect non-combatants, peasants' clergy, and even merchants from the unbridled violence of knights. Churches proclaimed that attacking these groups would bring spiritual punishment, including excommunication. Initially, the threat of divine wrath held some sway. Knights feared being cut off from the sacraments or denied burial rites, which in a deeply religious society was a terrifying prospect. By the 11th century, the Truce of God was added, seeking to restrict the days when knights could engage in warfare. Fighting on Sundays, religious holidays, or holy festivals was formally forbidden. The Church even attempted to regulate who knights could attack, and under what circumstances, insisting that violence must be directed only at legitimate enemies or in the service of God. Despite these measures, compliance was limited. Knights accustomed to living by the sword and motivated by wealth, status, and opportunity often ignored ecclesiastical decrees when convenient. Chroniclers of the time frequently noted instances where knights openly defied church mandates, looting villages, sacking monasteries, or even attacking clergy when it suited their ambition. The ideal of moral restraint clashed with the realities of a warrior's life, where personal gain and survival often outweighed spiritual concerns. The military orders such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights were an attempt to channel knightly violence towards sanctioned goals: crusades, protection of pilgrims, and defence of Christian territories. These orders emphasized discipline, obedience, and a code of conduct that theoretically limited acts of indiscriminate cruelty. Yet even within these groups, human ambition, rivalry, and the lure of riches sometimes overrode moral codes. Knights of the Templar, for instance, were famed not only for their piety and bravery, but also for their wealth, political manoeuvring, and at times ruthless pragmatism. In practice, the Church's influence was often symbolic rather than effective. Knights could publicly swear oaths to uphold the peace of God while privately raiding villages or extorting local populations. The contrast between ecclesiastical ideal and social reality underscores the paradox of medieval knighthood armour and sword. Symbolised honour but unchecked power often resulted in terror. Even as the Church sought to limit the scope of violence, it inadvertently reinforced the knight's mystique. By positioning them as both sacred and sanctioned warriors, the Church granted legitimacy to a class of men whose actions frequently betrayed the very principles they were meant to uphold. The attempts at control highlight the tension between faith and force morality, and survival law and brute strength, tensions that would define the knightly world until the rise of professional armies and modern warfare. Thus, the Church's efforts, though sincere in intent, reveal both the limits of spiritual authority and the pervasiveness of knightly violence. Knights were men trained to kill, conditioned by a culture of feudal power, and often impervious to moral constraints. The peace of God and truce of God were noble ideas, but in a world dominated by steel and ambition, they were fragile shields against the chaos knights could unleash. Decline on the battlefield. By the 14th century, the age of the armoured knight was coming to an end. For centuries, knights had dominated battlefields across Europe, their shining armour and thunderous cavalry charges striking terror into opponents. But technology, tactics, and sheer numbers began to turn the tide against them, revealing vulnerabilities that had long been hidden behind steel and legend. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was a watershed moment. The French army, composed largely of heavily armoured knights, charged repeatedly against the English forces entrenched behind defensive stakes. English longbowmen unleashed volleys of arrows with deadly precision. Hundreds of knights fell pierced by arrows that penetrated armour in ways previously thought impossible. Horses, once symbols of unstoppable force, were mowed down, leaving men trapped in their own heavy armour. Chroniclers described scenes of chaos, knights struggling in mud weapons, breaking under pressure, and commanders urging charges that only led to more slaughter. Less than 70 years later at Agincourt in 1415, the same story repeated with grim consistency. The French knights, confident in their superiority, advanced across a narrow, muddy battlefield hampered by rain and terrain. English archers with longbows strung tight decimated their ranks before swords were even drawn. The result was catastrophic. Thousands of knights perished, and many who fell were trampled under the weight of their own armour. It was a brutal demonstration that skill and courage alone could not guarantee survival against innovation and strategy. Gunpowder further hastened the decline. Cannons and early firearms shattered castle walls and pierced plate armor, making once impenetrable fortresses, and the knights within them vulnerable. The dominance of mounted, heavily armored warriors was undermined not only by weaponry, but by evolving battlefield tactics. Foot soldiers trained in pike formations and coordinated maneuvers could now repel cavalry charges that had once routed entire armies. The decline was not limited to military defeats. The social and economic foundations of knighthood were eroding. Kings raised professional armies funded by taxes and paid wages, reducing reliance on feudal levies of knights. Mercenary companies proliferated further, blurring the line between noble warriors and hired swords. The prestige of the knight was increasingly symbolic rather than practical, their power constrained by the rise of centralized authority and technological change. Yet even in defeat, the knight retained an aura of mystique. Armor gleamed in tournaments rather than on battlefields. Jousts became spectacles for entertainment celebrating skill without the bloodshed of actual war. The image of the knight as a gallant hero persisted, obscuring the grim reality of battlefield slaughter and the systemic violence of medieval society. The decline on the battlefield marks a turning point in history. It demonstrates how innovation, adaptation, and social change can dismantle even the most seemingly invincible institutions. Knights once feared as apex predators of medieval Europe became vulnerable, their swords no longer enough to ensure dominance. The era of cavalry supremacy was fading, leaving behind legend scars and the haunting echoes of hoofbeats on mud-soaked fields. Death of the knightly class and legacy. By the late 15th century, the age of the knight as a dominant force on European battlefields was effectively over. The combination of longbows, cannons, gunpowder, and standing armies had rendered traditional cavalry charges obsolete. Knights who once struck fear into enemies with the thunder of hooves and the gleam of steel now found themselves outmatched by infantry and firearms. Many knights adapted by becoming mercenaries, lending their skills to the highest bidder, often crossing national and political lines. Others sought wealth and status in courtly life, participating in tournaments and ceremonial duties rather than real warfare. Armor became more symbolic than practical, and the knightly ideal shifted from battlefield supremacy to pageantry and reputation. Yet despite their decline in practical power, knights maintained a cultural and symbolic influence that would endure for centuries. Poets, chroniclers, and storytellers immortalized them in romance and legend. Figures like King Arthur Rowland and William Marshall were celebrated for bravery, honor, and loyalty, regardless of the historical truths of their deeds. These stories softened the harsh reality of knights as instruments of violence, turning predators into heroes in the imagination of later generations. The dual legacy of the knight is striking. On one hand, knights were symbols of brutality, oppression, and the unchecked exercise of power. They pillaged villages, committed acts of terror, and often flouted both law and morality. On the other hand, their image became the foundation of chivalric ideals, courage, loyalty, honor, and the defense of the weak. Ideals that continue to shape literature, film, and popular imagination to this day. The decline of knights also reflects the broader transformation of European society. Centralized states, professional armies, and technological innovation reduced the relevance of feudal warriors. Medieval Europe evolved from a world ruled by armed nobles to one dominated by institutions and strategies that emphasized coordination, logistics, and new forms of power. In this sense, the death of the knightly class symbolizes the end of one era and the beginning of another, where individual martial prowess gave way to collective military and political organization. Even as their practical role faded, knights left an indelible mark on history. Castles' armor heraldry and stories remain reminding us of a time when might and status were inseparable, and when the line between heroism and atrocity was often blurred. The knightly legacy is thus a mirror of the Middle Ages itself, a world of contradictions where glory coexisted with terror, valor with cruelty, and legend with harsh reality. As we look back, we see the armored figures of history not only as relics of the past, but as symbols of a society defined by ambition, violence, and the relentless pursuit of power. The echoes of their hooves, the glint of their swords, and the tales of their deeds, both noble and monstrous, continue to fascinate, horrify,